It started like any other morning, quiet and calm. My golden retriever Jasper lying by my feet as I sipped coffee on the front porch of my newly purchased home in Oak Ridge Trails, a suburban community that promised peace, security, and according to the glossy brochures, respectful neighbors and pristine regulation, which I had chuckled at the first time I read it, not because I expected trouble, but because after 15 years as a federal disability rights attorney, I had learned that when people start flaunting rules like decorations, they often use them to hide their ignorance or inflate their authority. And sure enough, just 2 weeks after moving in, I found a folded letter in my mailbox, not from the post office, but hand-delivered and marked urgent HOA, pet violation, printed in bold red ink, like it was a courtroom summons, and, as I unfolded it, I saw that the president of the HOA, a woman named Marlene Whitaker, had filed a formal notice against me for keeping a dog over 35 pounds in direct violation of Section 8B of the Oak Ridge Trails HOA pet restrictions, and that I had 72 hours to remove said animal or face escalating daily fines of $150, which made me laugh not because of the absurdity of the weight limit, but because she hadn't bothered to ask, research, or even observe that Jasper wasn't just a pet. He was my service dog, certified under federal ADA law to assist with my PTSD and balance disorder following a traumatic injury sustained while serving as legal counsel during a courthouse bombing case years ago. And now, instead of writing the legal briefs I had intended to finish that morning, I was suddenly forced to draft a formal response to what was, frankly, a textbook case of HOA overreach and disability discrimination. So I calmly walked back inside, opened my files, printed a copy of my federal service dog certification, along with a detailed legal summary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II and III compliance statutes, and I attached a brief cover letter stating, "Dear Ms. Whitaker, per federal ADA law, my service dog is not subject to local pet restrictions. Please retract the violation notice within 24 hours or face legal proceedings under the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm happy to provide you with an education on either pro bono." Then I hand-delivered the packet to the HOA Dropbox and returned to my porch, where Jasper, blissfully unaware of the legal storm brewing, wagged his tail at a passing squirrel, and I hoped, sincerely, that Marlene would realize her mistake and move on. But of course, this being an HOA run by someone clearly drunk on authority, I got an email the next morning. No apology, no retraction, just a cold, dismissive note stating that all rules must be applied equally to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood, and that she had confirmed with the HOA council that dogs over 35 pounds were not allowed, even with medical justifications, and that I could file a formal appeal to be reviewed at the next board meeting in 30 days. And that's when my sympathy turned to resolve, because not only had she doubled down on a legally indefensible position, she'd claimed to have legal backing for a violation of federal civil rights law, and that was something I couldn't let slide, not just for myself, but for the dozens, maybe hundreds, of others who'd probably been bullied, silenced, or fined in this same way. So I took the next step. I contacted the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and filed a formal discrimination complaint under the Fair Housing Act, submitting every letter, email, and policy she had quoted, along with proof of my condition, Jasper's certification, and a detailed legal memo outlining the violations in her process. And while I waited for the case to be assigned, I posted publicly in the Oak Ridge Community Forum, not with aggression but transparency, sharing my experience and a summary of the law, urging anyone else who had been wronged to come forward. And to my surprise, the messages started pouring in. Residents who had been fined for installing ramps, for using walkers on the grass, for unsightly medical transport vans, one even forced to remove a stairlift from their porch because it didn't match the aesthetic. And with each message, I compiled a growing case file against not just Marlene, but the entire HOA board that had allowed this pattern of exclusion to go unchecked. And when HUD finally confirmed my complaint had been escalated for full investigation, I notified the HOA with a courtesy copy and a final warning. You now face a federal discrimination probe. This is your last opportunity to resolve this amicably. Still, silence. And then, a week later, the fines began auto-generating, charged to my account without hearing, warning, or review. And that was the moment I moved from negotiation to litigation, drafting a federal lawsuit for injunctive relief and damages under the AID, FHA, and Civil Rights Act Section 1983. And when I filed, it didn't just get attention, it made news, because I was the first federally certified disability rights attorney to sue a residential HOA for discriminatory enforcement of a pet restriction. And suddenly reporters were emailing me, asking questions. And HUD investigators began showing up at board member homes with subpoenas. And only then, when the board began to fracture and the threat of federal court became real, did Marlene email me a pathetic, one-paragraph resolution offer, stating that the HOA would waive the violation in good faith if I dropped the lawsuit and signed a non-disclosure agreement. And I remember reading it while standing in my yard, Jasper at my side, birds chirping overhead, thinking about how many people before me had probably accepted that same deal just to keep peace, and I said out loud, "No more." And I walked back inside, rejected the offer, and prepared for a trial that would not only defend my right to live freely with my service dog, but expose every rule, every bias, every act of intimidation that HOA had inflicted on others, because this wasn't about me anymore, it was about all of us. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the overhead lights as I sat at the plaintiff's table in a federal district court, Jasper sitting calmly at my feet, vest on, tail still, eyes alert but at peace, unaware of the weight this day carried not just for me, but for every disabled homeowner who had ever been bullied, fined, or shamed into silence by a housing board that thought itself above the law. And across from me, Marlene Whitaker sat rigid at the defense table, with her overpriced attorney, a stiff man in a pinstripe suit who clearly had no idea what kind of firestorm they had walked into, because the moment the judge entered and the proceedings began, I let the facts speak for themselves. Documented violations of the HOA, repeated refusals to accommodate a federally protected service dog, unlawful fines, threats of property liens, and a blatant attempt to silence a disabled resident through intimidation. And when I presented the testimony emails from Marlene that denied accommodations outright, financial records showing aggressive enforcement of rules only toward visibly disabled residents, and the testimony of 7 community members who spoke about their own HOA harassment, the judge's expression shifted from board neutrality to something I recognized very well, restrained outrage, the kind that bubbles just beneath the surface of legal decorum. And when the HOA's attorney argued that the service animal policies were intended to maintain harmony in the neighborhood, I calmly leaned forward and responded, the only thing these policies maintained was systemic discrimination. And then I produced HUD's investigation report, which confirmed widespread violations and recommended a full compliance overhaul. And by the end of the second day of trial, the defense had stopped objecting and started asking for settlement terms. But I wasn't interested in a private deal with hush money. Not this time. I wanted a court-ordered judgment, a permanent injunction, and public accountability. And after 3 days of testimony and a binder of evidence, the judge issued his ruling right there in court. The Oak Ridge Trails HOA was guilty of multiple violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, ordered to pay me $100,000 in damages, publicly retract the violation, and apologize in writing, and most importantly, implement a complete policy overhaul with mandatory federal disability compliance training for all current and future board members. And, in that moment, as I stood with Jasper at my side, hearing the ruling read aloud, I felt not vindication or revenge, but peace. A deep knowing that something truly meaningful had been accomplished. And the aftermath was swift. Marlene resigned from the HOA within a week, issuing a bitter half-hearted apology in the community newsletter. The HOA's legal team was fired, replaced by a consulting firm that specialized in civil rights compliance. And I was asked tripidly by neighbors to help form a new oversight committee to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. And while I initially declined, wanting to return to quiet life, the messages I received from residents changed my mind. An elderly woman with a walker, who said she could finally install a ramp, a Gulf War vet who now felt comfortable putting his wheelchair lift back on his truck, a family whose autistic son used a therapy dog and had lived in fear of eviction for years. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a legal victory, it was a cultural shift, and if I could help shape it, even temporarily, I owed it to the people who never had a voice. So I accepted a non-voting advisory role and helped draft a new HOA charter section on accessibility, including permanent protections for service animals, mobility aids, and invisible disabilities. And for the first time in Oak Ridge Trails history, the rules were written by someone who actually understood the law, the people, and the purpose of community, not uniformity, but unity. And, though some board members resisted at first, citing tradition and property value, they were quickly overruled by a wave of support from residents who had finally seen what real leadership looked like. And even as I watched the last of Marlene's legacy be removed, ridiculous pet weight limits, style-based discrimination, and those infamous violation slips with red ink, I stayed humble, reminding myself that none of this was about ego or even Jasper. It was about changing the culture of fear into one of dignity. And every morning after that, when I sat on my porch with coffee in hand and Jasper at my side, neighbors waved instead of whispered, kids ran by with their dogs laughing freely, and the HOA newsletter, once filled with warnings and citations, now printed articles about accessibility, inclusion, and even had a column called Know Your Rights that I was asked to write monthly. And I did so happily, not for praise, but because every word helped ensure that what happened to me would never happen again. Not in this neighborhood, not under this HOA, and maybe, just maybe, my fight inspired others across the country to challenge their own local tyrants, because in the end, the lesson was clear. Service, loyalty, and the law are far more powerful than any clipboard, any fine, and any attempt to silence what was never theirs to control our freedom.